as Chris said, I spent a lot of my career working in the SRI, which is doing research that is intended to be directly policy relevant. Before doing that, I spent 7 or 8 years in the central bank, and since then I've been in the university. So I guess my perspective on this topic is framed by my experience in those 3 rather different roles, all something to do with research and public policy. And I guess I would maybe, from that perspective, try and inject a few skeptical notes as I go in terms of the role that researchers should be trying to play and the research that they do try to play in influencing public policy. Now, I guess the first issue is, what are we trying to do in doing research? And the core aim there, I think, is quite simply to make a contribution to knowledge. I think that has to be front and centre in judging how good a job we do and how we articulate and try and justify to funders what it is that we're trying to do. I must say that in 30 years of doing policy-related research, I would find it very difficult to point to one specific policy measure that has been altered a jot as a result of anything I've written. And I don't think that's untypical. So I think it would be highly unwise, for a start, psychologically apart from anything else, for us to set ourselves the goal of having a measurable impact on policy. Because policy gets framed with all sorts of other considerations involved, which we've heard about already this afternoon and this morning, and if you happen to be lucky enough to be in a position where something you do gets taken on and is used to justify a policy decision, that's unusual, and you can treat yourself to a pint, but it's not, I think, to be taken as a key performance indicator that we either set ourselves, or that our institutions set for us, or that we indeed allow funders to set for us. Now, on the other hand, if we're open to the accusation that nothing we do is of relevance to policy, then I think it means we're doing a very bad job, and it also means we're very vulnerable when it comes to justifying getting our salaries paid. But the other side of it is that one of the most pressing and compelling reasons to me for thinking that researchers should focus on issues that policymakers are focused on is that they're often very hard issues. That in some sense, the road of least resistance in doing research is to try and add another brick in the wall of the research that is appearing in the journals and that we think we can have something perhaps important, perhaps marginal, to add to that. If we simply take that as the frame of reference, that in some sense is taking the easy road. Because very often policymakers are asking much harder questions. And the reason that we're not addressing them in our research is because they're so hard. So in some sense, I think, engaging with policy issues is a way of keeping ourselves honest, is a way of keeping ourselves focused on genuinely hard issues, rather than ones that are fashionable but easier to address. Now, thinking about it again from the perspective of a university researcher, why would we want a university researcher to be engaged in policy-relevant research? How would we know if they were? And how would we try and encourage that? Well, it's striking that the Irish university incentive system, as it is currently constructed, And this may be truer now than it was 10 years ago, and maybe it won't be as true in 10 years' time. But right now, my reading of it is that there is very little incentive directly at an individual level for university researchers to engage with issues of the day. There's only so many hours in the day, and time spent engaging with such issues and trying to disseminate the results of your research in a way that's accessible, trying to engage with public debate, trying to do research on things that are arising out of policy dilemmas that policymakers are facing and that we as a society are facing. That's not the best way to get an article in a good journal and get promoted. Now, universities, certainly my university, but I don't think it's untypical in that respect, have a rhetoric of societal engagement. They don't have reward systems that reflect that, as far as I can see. Now, this is going to be a particular problem in a small country with bad data. Because if you want to get published in the Economic Journal or the American Economic Review, to just take my own discipline, doing research on Ireland is not the way to do it. Downloading data from the top-notch data set that somebody has gone to the trouble of producing for the USA or the UK very often is a much more sensible strategy. And as a result, what you tend to find is that very good papers to a high level of technical sophistication and published in good journals have what I find very irritating throwaway sections on policy at the end of them that have been put in as some sort of a nod to the notion that the research should be policy relevant, but are effectively ill-informed about the actual institutional structures in the policy area that they're relating to, and are straining to try and appear as if some policy relevant conclusion can be drawn. I think it would be much more productive to stop the paper before writing that section, because it's actually not doing justice to the policy issue and is misleading as to the nature of the product. And I'm not in any sense belittling the product, it's just a different product. What you also tend to find very often, I think, is a sometimes well-masked and sometimes not very well-masked unease or disdain for the messiness of the policy-making world. And I must say, this comes through when you read the debates that we've had about policy in the Republic over the last 6 or 9 months, for example, to do with cleaning up the financial system. And I have to say that some of the language that's been used by academics in talking about these debates, where policymakers are either fools or knaves, seems to me to be inaccurate as a description of the world and unhelpful in trying to get an audience. So I think in understanding how the policy-making community is going to receive what we try to disseminate to them, it would be helpful if we put ourselves in their shoes a bit, which I think we first of all find difficult to do, because it's a very different world, but also I think if you want to be taken seriously by policymakers, you have to walk a bit of the time in their shoes. Because they know that not being stupid, by and large, they know where we're coming from. And they know that to some extent our interest in them is in their funding. Because very often what we really want from policymakers when we say we want to engage with them is that we want them to pay us so that we can do better research. Now that is an entirely laudable aim on our part, but let's not think that anyone is fooled here, that that's not what's going on. That is what we should be doing and should be arguing for in and of its own, we should be arguing for the value that we see this activity has. When you look at it from the policymaker's perspective, of course, the world looks very different. As has been said already, the timescales are completely different to the ones that we're familiar. We know how long it takes to do good research. They've got to make decisions now. Very often they don't have the expertise in the social sciences, and that's a problem. And there's the culture in Ireland, at least, of the generalist versus the expert. We don't have enough people with social science training in policy-making positions. And that's something that can be rectified, and I think other countries do a better job there. It's undoubtedly the case that our Department of Finance is now under-skilled in terms of economists. Would Ireland now be in a much better position if we had more economists in the Department of Finance? I'm not sure it's that simple. These policymakers are going to make decisions on the basis of the information that they have available to them now, next week, and next month. If we can convey our output in a way that can land on their desk and make an impact, we have some hope of influencing their thinking and the context in which they make decisions, rather than making a big impact on a specific decision. I don't think that's necessarily the aim we should be setting for ourselves. We have to realize that policymakers, this disdain works both ways. The policymakers very often have some degree of disdain for what they regard as ivory tower academics who don't have to grapple with the real world decisions that they have to grapple with, and who, when commissioned to do research, are very often late, they miss the deadline, and the material provided may not answer the question that the policymaker wanted answering, and said they wanted answering, and put in the terms of reference. Because the researcher answers the question either that they're interested in answering or that they find it possible to answer. Because what was in the terms of reference was actually too hard in the first place. And we were told earlier that we should use an anecdote, so my anecdote is a second-hand one of the researcher who was commissioned to review research that had been done on commission for the Department of Environment in the UK over a 10-year period. And they looked at it and they saw whether it fulfilled the terms of reference, whether it was technically well carried out, whether the data looked pretty respectable, whether the conclusions looked founded in the evidence, and so on. And the conclusion the reviewer reached was that in about 80% of the cases, this was pretty good research. And not only that, but it had done its very best to speak to the question that was addressed. And reporting back to the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry, they said, this is what we're finding. And by the way, did it have any impact on your decisions? To which the response was, dear boy, that's not what it's about. Because policymakers, when they commission research, often are not looking for necessarily an answer to a specific question that they can use to inform their policy making. They're looking for something that will provide them with some cover. So, where does this leave us in terms of how we articulate for a role for social science research in influencing public policy? I think clearly we can argue for and justify a mix of funding structures where we are funded both to do specific focused policy research, answering questions that policymakers want answered, and more general thematic research on issues of societal importance. And that's where I would go in conclusion, in that I think where we seek for our relevance is, as Sermon put it, we seek for our relevance primarily in societal rather than specific policy relevance. That should be the benchmark, and that's what we should be arguing for, that we provide in our research, that it is societally relevant, not necessarily in even the majority of cases, narrowly policy relevant and having a measurable policy impact. So I hope that serves to provoke a few reactions. Thank you.